Hello, my name is Jeffrey Watson,
And I'm Ethan Edwards.
and this is the Ridge Podcast. Hello, everyone. Today we have a book talk.
Yeah.
Another book talk. It's been a little while. Last time we did White Nights by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I said it right this time. Today we have on a more widely known novel in America.
Yeah.
Probably one of the most famous novels of all time.
Yep.
The Great Gatsby by Mr.
F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Scott Fitzgerald, who I'm doing a speech on this week.
Yeah. What do you say, old sport?
Oh yeah, old sport. I said that for about a month after reading the novel. But yeah, F. Scott Fitzgerald, a very interesting character. I don't know if you know much about him. He lived his books. He lived his books. So when he was writing a book, he modeled it pretty much off his life. So The Great Gatsby was written while he was in Paris. And while he was in Paris, he went through a very, almost a playboy party phase, so to speak. So, and he was married, so playboy. But so yeah, he kind of modeled it after himself a little bit, and the novel's extremely widely known. I mean, everybody knows what The Great Gatsby, even if they haven't read it.
Yeah.
They know some, I don't know, what's the word for it? They know some facts about it, I guess.
Maybe not necessarily, but they know of its existence.
They know who Jay Gatsby is. So, even if people haven't read it, they've heard of it, as I've said. But I think me and Ethan's goal here recently is to actually read the books that they've heard of, but they never read.
Yeah, for sure.
So you say, have you heard of this book? Of course I have. Have you read it?
No.
So I'm going to ask someone when they say, have you read it? Yes, I have. So today we're doing The Great Gatsby.
Yeah.
Ethan, you want to kind of start it off here?
Yeah, so the story kind of starts out with Mr. Nick Carraway. I guess that's how you're supposed to say it. And he talks about how his father had told him once that not everyone was as fortunate as he was in life. And he says it in kind of a roundabout kind of way. And Nick talks about how this makes an impression on him as a boy. And he's tried to keep it in mind throughout his life. But at times it has some consequences. Like people will think he's a politician because he listens more than he speaks.
Yeah.
And people turn it into this negative thing. And Nick says like he doesn't think it should be one or is one. And he's kind of arrogantly aware of himself. He realizes that he's blessed, but he thinks he's better for realizing that he's blessed.
And he also tries to make himself too. You know, Nick Carraway, he's really the straight man in the story, right?
Yeah.
He's the only really
He's the only one that's not
normal
insane.
That's insane. That's not really out there. But yeah, Nick, I think he feels kind of guilty in some sense. But he's also self-made.
Yeah, he is.
He left. He moved out to the East Coast.
Yeah. Well, for the most part, you can't say he's entirely self-made because...
No, I mean, he's had a lot of help.
Yeah, because he talks about in the beginning of the book how his father had agreed to support him for a year as he was learning, and I don't think that's entirely self-made, but...
No, I mean, I don't think anybody is entirely self-made, but he's working for himself, kind of. He's working for a company, but he's trying to better himself. He starts the book off, he's living in a cottage in
kind of.
is it East Egg or West Egg? I think it's West Egg where he lived. Which is almost like an island chain in Long Island, New York.
Yeah, West Egg.
West Egg, and he lives in the shadow of this big mansion in this small house. And it talks about how, and this is kind of a point of how he is a go-getter out there. He's reading all these stock and bond books, trying to educate himself.
Yeah.
So he is trying to make himself, but he's also very distracted.
Yeah.
He sees everybody else. It's the 20s.
Yeah.
It's the roaring 20s, and can I have some kind of historical background here? They really call it the lost generation. You have people that fought in World War I, and they came back, and there wasn't really any sense of direction anymore. So they drank and they partied, and the economy was soaring. So you have all these people really living life to the fullest, and he's very distracted by this.
Yeah, he is.
And that's kind of where the book starts off.
Yeah, and it talks about how Jay Gatsby, the book's namesake, has these parties constantly. And one day, Nick gets an invitation to the party.
He does, yes. He gets an invitation.
Yeah, but just because you get an invitation, just because you go to the party doesn't mean you received an invitation. People will just show up and party. And,
so they show up and party. So Nick's cousin, Daisy, has moved from Cleveland, and she lives on East Egg across the Sound. He can see their house. He can see the green. They have this green light on their dock, and it can be seen from across the from across Long Island Sound. So Nick's cousin Daisy and her husband Tom, who was this very brass college athlete type.
Yeah.
Which Nick knew in college. They were pretty good friends in college. And that's his cousin's Daisy's husband, Tom. So they get invited to their house for lunch, and Daisy, she's different. She's kind of out there. She's sane, but what's the right term for it? She's
tread lightly here.
yeah. You kind of want to. She's
unique.
She's very unique.
Eccentric.
Eccentric. There you go. And her husband Tom's very brass and over the top.
Yeah, and something else that kind of stuck out to me was in the book it kind of described him as almost feminine in the initial encounter, and it said that his clothes were feminine, but his ripped, strong body
and his attitude's definitely not.
Yeah. His ripped, strong body poked through the clothing.
Yeah, and also at this dinner is Daisy's friend Jordan Baker, and she is a professional golfer, and she's very pretty. She's beautiful, and Nick realizes this very early on, of course.
Yeah.
So they have dinner, and Tom Buchanan. He has very interesting political views.
Yes, he does.
I probably shouldn't discuss it on the podcast, but it's very controversial on race.
Yeah, he's kind of a neo-Nazi.
Yeah.
Or I guess at the time there were no neo-Nazis. I guess he was kind of a Nazi.
He wasn't. Well, it wasn't even really a thing. It was just kind of. He was
racist.
He was very racist. Yes, and but I think he was always like that. He got infatuated by these new ideas. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
She said he read a new book, and this is his personality now after he read that book. So he could be swept very easily.
Yeah, and you kind of want to commend him for trying to learn, because he's trying to advance his knowledge, but he's just a bit misguided. He's reading these awful...
and you probably won't get in trouble for saying that, as most people probably haven't read the book. But if they have read the book, you realize what Ethan just says, commending Tom Buchanan.
Oh no, I'm commending him for trying to...
I'm
commending him from trying to learn
think about
more.
This, Ethan. Back then they didn't have TV.
Yeah.
So basically he was just doing what everybody used to do, was just read.
Yeah.
He could be reading, political theory, but he wasn't. He was reading books on race, but that's besides the point. So they're having dinner, and Daisy's talking to Nick, and she's kind of worried. He's kind of becoming distant almost. And during dinner, he stands up. He's got a phone call, and he leaves the room. But he makes sure he closes the door. And of course, Tom's having an affair, and Daisy kind of knows it's somebody in New York, but she's not really sure who it is.
Yeah.
So this kind of sets the mood that the relationship is definitely not perfect.
Yeah. And someone remarks, I don't remember who it is, how inconsiderate Myrtle, the lady that Tom's having an affair with, how inconsiderate she is for calling during dinner.
Yeah,
she always seems to call during dinner time.
Everybody's very open and
very straightforward.
100 miles per hour the whole story.
Yeah,
everybody's very calm. And I guess it's the time period too where it was the roaring 20s in New York City. Everybody was making money.
They certainly don't beat around the bush.
No, not at all. So Nick goes to this dinner, and he goes over there pretty often, and he kind of reforms a relationship with this Jordan Baker woman. It starts off slow at first, and just for a while there, the novel kind of just, it doesn't go anywhere for about a chapter. It's just Nick's kind of living his life, and he thought everything would be going really fast, but it's not. The summer's just kind of just waning away. And he has this neighbor, and this is where the story really kicks off. He's very mysterious. He sees him standing. There's your U.S. military aircraft flying over.
Whew.
Fighter jets. Keep that in. That's pretty cool.
That is cool.
I normally run out and look at them, but we're doing this.
Yeah.
So Nick's neighbor, he hasn't met him yet.
Yeah.
He sees him staring at him kind of from like the windows and stuff. He's a very mysterious figure.
Yeah, enigmatic, I think.
Very, yes. And he has these big parties. And one day, servant comes to Nick's house, and he invites them to this party.
Yeah, so this is what I was talking about earlier. Nick, I skipped a few skipped a few steps, but this is what I was talking about earlier when I talked about Nick receiving an invitation to the party.
Yeah.
And not everyone had always received invitations, even if they went.
Yeah. A lot of times it's kind of just like what people did. They just showed up.
Yeah.
And very famous people. They had their first party, and it's pretty crazy. There's bands there. There's alcohol flowing.
Yeah. There's a pool too.
Religiously, yes. There's a pool. Everybody's singing and dancing. They meet a lot of interesting people. He goes to Jordan Baker. I think it's interesting. I've read a lot of books from this time period. When people went on dates, they weren't really. It was kind of different. They kind of went off with other people and danced and kind of, you know what I mean? Yeah. It was more of a
group dating.
Yeah, it wasn't really, because I've read some Hemingway the past few weeks too, and it's almost exactly like that. And both books are set in the 20s, and they're written almost in the 20s. Both of them were. Yeah, it was the dynamic of early dating was very different than it is in even really today. For sure today, absolutely. So Jordan was kind of going off and talking to people, and so was Nick. And Nick starts to talk to this guy, and the guy's really interested. They start talking about the war. They talk about the war and his medals and his experiences. And Nick thinks he's an interesting guy. Yeah. He doesn't realize
that he's Jay Gatsby.
That's Jay Gatsby's owner of the mansion. So Nick says, he says, "Where's this Gatsby guy? I've never met him before."
Yeah.
He says he's never been bothered to come over and talk to me. He says, "Well, I'm Jay Gatsby."
Yeah.
And that's when you stick your foot in your mouth. That's one of those situations. But immediately they hit it off.
Yeah. And
he actually invites him the next day to go fly a plane with him.
Yeah, water.
Yeah, like a water.
Hydroplane, I think is what they call it.
Like a seaplane almost.
Seaplane, hydroplane, something. Not hydroplane, but
it's a seaplane where they take off from the water and fly around and land again. So they invite him the next day. So he meets Jay Gatsby finally, and then Jordan Baker comes back, and it's kind of weird because at this point Nick and Jordan are on a date basically, and Jay Gatsby asks Jordan to go and talk with her in this library. And they met this interesting character in the library before. Jay Gatsby has a bunch of books, but none of them look like they've ever been really read. So it's the same library that scene took place in a little bit earlier. So Jay Gatsby asked Jordan, "Come and talk to me," and they talk for like an hour and a half.
Yeah. I think it says just over an hour in the book.
Yeah. And afterwards she comes out and she's totally, flummoxed? She's totally like head over heels for this Jay Gatsby. Not really in love, but just nobody's really in love with Jay Gatsby.
She's amazed.
They're amazed by Jay Gatsby. He's very mysterious.
Yeah.
And you see at the party, everybody thinks he's a murderer or he's the
shady
nephew of
rich person.
Or actually the leader of Germany.
Yeah, People think he was in he served for Germany in the war. People say because he kind of openly acknowledges that he was a veteran, but he never really says for who, and people are kind of incorrectly infer that he was German and that
the Kassler. So they kind of make their idea of who Jay Gatsby is.
Yeah,
it's
they
like
do.
A story. Have you ever when you see people out in town, you kind of create stories for them?
No,
You ever done that kind of thing? And you see people walking around, what are they doing?
I'm not a psychopath.
That's kind of what that's not a psychopath. Just kind of say, what could that person's life be like? That's kind of people do Jay Gatsby. Everybody has their own version of who he is. So everybody's amazed by him. And Jordan comes out and she's amazed. But she doesn't tell Nick what they've really talked about. So they leave. And that's basically it. Nick and Jay become pretty good friends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They see each other pretty often.
Yeah. So just for a bit of context, I haven't had time to sit down and read the book this week, so I listened to the 6-hour audiobook over the last few days of work, and I missed a few parts, and Luke's making fun of me for it.
And I read the book a few months ago, so but it's a great book. It stuck with me. So after this, they're living their lives. Nick's working a lot.
Yeah.
The summer's not really going the way, as I said before, the way he thought it was going to be. Mm-hmm. He keeps on going off this Jordan Baker girl. They see each other pretty often, but it's not really, you know what I mean? Mm. It's not his story, Nick's story. Even though he's the narrator. He's the narrator. It isn't his story. It's Jay Gatsby's story. And we see these parties continuing. we see different scenes between Tom and Daisy and kind of how their story kind of played out. The book is hard to talk about in a chronological sense because most of the book happens in flashbacks. Kind of, you see, especially towards the end of the book.
Yeah.
You see characters explaining
what happened. Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to talk about in that type of sense, which I don't think we should go scene by scene, really.
No.
But so things happen and they have their relationships. And so kind of some backstory here. I think this is a good time to talk about some backstory with Daisy and Jay Gatsby. So we don't really know much about Jay Gatsby. Nick kind of thinks he's a liar at first.
Yeah.
But then he pulls out all these medals he earned from the war, and it says Jay Gatsby from, I forget which.
I don't remember.
It's like some like small kingdom in Europe. He got a Medal of Honor for. Kinda. Yeah. So he's enthralled by him, and so we see their relationship develop. But he doesn't talk much about his personal life, really, until one day he asks. Jordan Baker talks to him. She says, "Listen, Jay Gatsby wants you to invite Daisy over to your house and don't bring Tom."
Yeah.
And Nick's like, "What?" It's really weird, So Nick asks Jay Gatsby, and we kind of get the story of what happens here. The Jay Gatsby we know was in the United States Army, and he shipped off to World War I. And before he shipped off, him and Daisy had a passionate romantic relationship. It was brief, but it was there. And they were going to getting married. They were going to continue their relationship after the war because they were pretty perfect for each other. And so he told her. So he says, "When you get back," and she says, "When you get back, come to me." He says, "Okay." But things happen, and he gets delayed a lot, and tries to go to school a little bit. And he sent letters to her, but they never kind of went really. And then he sent one letter saying he was coming back, but it got lost in it got kind of shuffled along, and she didn't get it. So she thought he was gone. She thought he'd lost interest in her. So she ended up marrying Tom Buchanan on a whim, and she missed Jay Gatsby, and he came back, and she was already married.
Yeah. Somewhere in the story it remarks, I guess Jay asks the question, why can't they just get a divorce? And someone says that they're Catholic and Catholics don't believe in divorce. So disregarding the theological statement, I just thought that was interesting. It never really says that they were Catholic in the story, and it actually talks a lot about Lutheranism, and I'm not sure the Lutheran Church's stance on divorce, but I don't recall them ever being explicitly stated as Catholic.
Because I thought it did mention it in the story.
Did it? Okay. So yeah, someone says to Nick, this thing about them being Catholic, and Nick reacts, "Daisy was not a Catholic," and I was a little shocked at the elaborateness of the lie. Yeah. So I was correct. They're not Catholic, but someone states that they were.
Jay Gatsby, I was saying before, Jay Gatsby, he comes back and he searches for her. And there's this really unique scene where he's walking the streets where they used to live, right? And the streets and the places that were once filled with so much joy, now he was just empty, really. So this is kind of where, at this point, he kind of starts his journey from an actual person almost to kind of a bigger than life character.
Yeah.
But his main goal here is to get back with Daisy eventually. So we figure out, so Nick talks to Jay, and we realize how far this kind of obsession with her has gone. He built this whole elaborate life
around Daisy.
Around her.
Yeah. And I mentioned this earlier.
He moved there for her.
Yeah, I mentioned this earlier, that he hosted these parties solely with the hope that Daisy would just come to one.
Come in. And he never drinks at these parties. Everybody else is getting crazy.
Yeah.
But he's not. And it's really romantic in a sense, but it's also kind of today people would call it throwing up red flags all over the place. I mean,
Luke's using slang.
Yeah, it's a lot of red flags here, but so Jay, and we've never really seen him like this before. He's a very confident guy. He's nervous.
Yeah.
And it kind of humanizes him a lot. You see him, he's a real person. So
just to clear up some confusion, this is while this is the tea party between Nick and Daisy that
Yeah,
Gatsby is just
he's
walking in
planning.
on.
Yeah, he's planning this whole thing. He's kind of setting it up.
Yeah, and Gatsby also offered to cut his grass.
Yeah,
and
because Nick thought he was talking about Gatsby's. I said Gatsby's grass.
Yeah.
He's talking about his grass. Yeah. So he's offered to kind of
Nick's house is basically revamped by Gatsby and his
because
staff.
he's bought all these like flowers and stuff to put in it. He's redecorating. So he's kind of making it. He's
kind of taking over.
Yeah, he's taking over his house. He's very not really flamboyant, but he's grand. He's very grand. So the day comes and it's raining, and there's a lot of symbolism in this book if you really read into it. The day comes and it's raining, and Jay Gatsby shows up, and he's really nervous, and he almost wants to leave. Almost, it's not perfect.
Yeah,
he wants it to be perfect. So Daisy shows up, and Nick looks back, and Jay's gone. Mm-hmm. And so Daisy comes in. All of a sudden, there's a knock at the door. He went around the house and knocks on the door, and he comes in that way.
Serendipitously appeared.
Yeah, and anybody worth their 2 cents would know this is all set up.
Yeah.
And what everybody thought would be a grand reunion didn't start off that way.
No.
It was very awkward.
Yeah, and
Jay was nervous. He was fumbling over his words a lot.
And then he broke a clock too.
Yeah, so the guy who was the most amazing, smooth, grand guy ever is kind of fumbling here.
Yeah.
Hard.
Yeah.
So then, we've all been in these moments where something's so awkward, we have to leave. Mm-hmm. And this is what this is what happens to Nick. It's so just insanely awkward. He leaves the room.
Yeah.
And he goes to the kitchen and starts making as much noise as he can, fixing food for them. He stays out for a while. And when he comes back in, everything's changed. They're really in deep conversation. So much that they didn't even know the rain stopped. The sun's shining now. Because they came in and they were in deep conversation, and they were so enraptured with each other. Jay was so concerned about the rain, he didn't even realize it had stopped anymore. So yeah, he comes in and they're sitting there and they're deep in conversation, talking about old times, and they're really enraptured with each other, like I said before, and nothing else in the world really matters at this point. And after this, they basically begin a love affair, right?
Yeah.
So they're back together, kinda.
Not officially.
Not officially, but pretty much. I mean, she's spending the night at his house, or spending days at his house pretty often. She's over there all the time. Jay, after this scene, Jay takes her to his house, and everything he's decorated it for.
Yeah.
And everything in it's to impress her, and it does.
Yeah, and I think maybe this is what I think of. She's brought to almost, I guess, to tears by how amazing it is. Yeah.
She starts crying when he's throwing all of his
shirts and stuff. Yeah.
Which I thought, how obvious is that? He's kind of showboating here.
Yeah, he is.
She says, "How much shirts do you have?" And he goes and takes out his whole wardrobe, and it's all this
the flannel, the silk.
Yeah, and all this crazy stuff. She starts crying. That's what it's the same scene. It's that same dinner.
Yeah, chapter.
The same not really party, but get together.
Yeah,
they're having a
tea party.
Yeah. So, and this is kind of really where the story really kind of gets really interesting.
Yeah.
That night, it starts to rain. It's storming, right? And Jay has some guy play the piano, and Nick's still over there for some reason. At that point, he probably should have took the hint and got out. Mm-hmm. But they're kind of just sitting there in a love stupor, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're totally lost with each other. And there's going to be problems, of course, in the story, but it doesn't really matter at this point. They're back together, and Jay's happy. We see in the story, Jay's really concerned about the past. He's obsessed with the past, and that's pretty much the main point of the story, right? Mm-hmm. Can you recreate what's already happened or what should have happened artificially, right?
Yeah.
It didn't happen. And he's trying to control the story himself now.
He's trying to play God.
Yeah, in this sense. So will it work out? At this point, we don't know.
Yeah.
The summer's continuing on, and more parties are happening, and eventually, And this is a really bold move on Jay Gatsby's part. He wants to meet Tom Buchanan, which reminds me of you've seen The Office, right?
Yeah.
When Michael Scott is dating the bar manager, do you remember that?
No.
And her husband's the
Her
husband's the baseball coach, and Michael goes to the game and shakes hands with him and stuff just to kind of meet him. It's kind of like that in the story. He wants to meet Tom, so they invite him all over, and the evening goes well. Tom's not really impressed with Jay.
Yeah.
He's kind of annoyed and put off by him.
He tries to disprove him too.
Yeah.
Like he questions him and asks how he got his money, and
Which happens many times in the story.
yeah, that's true. Many people do that.
Yeah, as they're leaving, he tells Daisy something's weird about this guy, and Jay was all over Daisy at this parties too, in front of her husband. Which I guess that can't be just the times. It might just be these loose, rich,
fantasy
socialites
well,
in New York. I guarantee you, even most husbands back in the day wouldn't let their wives go off and dance and party with another guy.
Well, you have to remember, A, this is a work of fiction, and B,
of course, but
Tom was also having an affair at the time, so it's not like he could really say a whole lot.
But he's very possessive, too.
He is.
He's very possessive. So I don't think it'd really matter. He's narcissistic in an extreme sense. So I don't think it would really matter for him. What's his is his, and he don't want anybody else to have it. He's very controlling. So he's pissed off by this whole kind of thing. He doesn't like Jay. Mm-hmm. And the story continues, and we see, Nick taking Jordan out and all this different stuff. And it's a very short novel. So yeah, the story continues, and they start hanging out more often with each other, right? And we skip the critical point earlier in the story, kind of on Tom Buchanan's side, right? So, and this happens pretty early in the story, but we're kind of going between different characters here right now. Tom Buchanan invites Nick to go to New York with him. You remember that scene? To meet his girlfriend by the name of Myrtle. And Myrtle has a husband, Mr. Wilson, who owns a gas station, who's very poor. Tom invites Nick to New York and to hang out with Myrtle in Myrtle's sister's apartment. And they get crazy drunk, like really drunk. And they start going crazy.
Doesn't Nick talk about how one of the benefits of not getting drunk, not being a drunk, is he doesn't get drunk and therefore doesn't do stupid things?
Yeah, but he says explicitly in the story, that night was one of the only nights of my life
Okay,
I've been
that's
completely and totally drunk.
Yeah. I think I'm referring to an earlier part of the story, maybe chapter 1 or chapter 2.
And then Tom Buchanan breaks Myrtle's sister's nose in the story.
Yeah.
And the very end of it, so it's like, it's all craziness. Everybody's losing their minds, and nobody really cares.
Yeah.
It's just like, that just happened. And no charges are pressed. Myrtle she's not mad. So that's kind of like a flashback into Tom's love affair with Myrtle. Yeah, so we kind of see the backstory of Tom Buchanan here. So they start all hanging out with each other. Jay Gatsby, Tom, Daisy, Jordan Baker, and Nick is getting continually pissed off at everybody.
Yeah. He's
starting to get annoyed by Jay.
Yeah.
Because even though Jay's story might be true, a lot of it's fabricated. And he says, I'm an Oxford man.
He's misrepresented himself.
Yeah.
He was at Oxford for 5 months.
5 months.
Yeah.
Totally. And so they're all very superficial, right? Extremely superficial. And one day, as we get farther into the story here, it's the hottest day of the summer. Mm-hmm. And this is probably the most vivid scene of the whole book.
Yeah.
It's the hottest day of the summer, and they decide, they're all kind of bickering and arguing with each other. Jay's there, and Tom knows something's up at this point. He knows they're having an affair. So it's kind of awkward, but they're all hanging out and drinking, and they decide, let's go to New York. And they said, okay. Well, Jay Gatsby drives Daisy to New York in his car. Mm. And Tom's like going 100 miles per hour, laughing and acting all crazy, driving Jordan Baker and Nick to New York. And they decide to go to this hotel and have cocktails. And this is where the whole story really breaks down in a way. Finally, Jake he has enough of it, and he confronts Tom Buchanan and says to Daisy, tell him you don't love him, you love me.
Yeah.
And she starts to cry, and she can't really do nothing. And finally she says that she doesn't really love him, but she did at one point. And this is not enough for Jay Gatsby. And at this point, we see him, I respect him, how that he's in love and everything like that, but he kind of makes me mad here. It's obvious she loves him, right?
Yeah.
It's obvious. And he could have gotten his way. It could have worked out. And it almost did work out. But at this point, he's putting her on the spot, really. He's making her extremely uncomfortable. And he's not being considerate whatsoever. You can love, this is bad to say, but sometimes people love more people at the same time. She loved Tom Buchanan in a way, right?
Yeah.
And it was very selfish of...
Or at least she did at one time.
At one point. And it was very selfish of Jay to say that she never loved him. Because obviously she did.
Like she had to publicly refute to recant her love for Tom.
Yeah. And
forever.
And Tom tells Jay, we've been through stuff and done stuff you can't imagine doing. Right? And Jay's like, what does that mean? So they're both kind of like in Daisy's ear here. And they're not really fighting with each other. They're kind of, it's like, the devil and angel on each other. I don't know which one's the devil and which one's the angel here.
on Daisy's shoulder.
Because they're both, Jay's not terrible, but he's doing terrible things. It's not improper things. And Tom's pretty terrible.
Yeah.
But he has a right to be mad, even though he is a hypocrite.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of
back and forth.
Back and forth in this story. And finally Daisy flips out. She doesn't know what to do. She just kind of crumples. Yeah. And at this point we see that nobody's going to get anywhere. Because it says explicitly, but each time Jay says another word, she's pulling farther and farther away from him. Mm-hmm. So the more he's trying to get her to come, she's withdrawing.
And Nick
says, go.
Nick's narrating this, and
or not Nick, yeah.
He says it's like visible.
Yeah.
That each time Jay opens his mouth. Herself. Yeah.
And finally Tom says, you know what, Daisy? He says, have at it. You know what I mean? He says, do what you want to do.
Yeah.
And then, but she doesn't leave. She says, Jay, I did love him. And then you see Jay's just kind of crushed. But she said, I love you too. She's just been thankful. Because, it didn't end in violence. Because Tom's a lot bigger than Jay Gatsby. He's a massive man. So they decide Jay whisk her away and they leave. Right? But before this, Jay flips out almost on Tom, has this outburst of anger. Mm-hmm. Right? And so he apologizes and then they leave. And they're followed by Tom Buchanan and Nick and Jordan Baker. And Jordan and Nick at this point are not even really, you know what I mean? Their relationship's almost collapsed in a way. Mm-hmm. They're not really like they used to be. So Jay is flying, and Daisy, they're flying in this big yellow car, Jay's car. They took his car out.
Yeah. And
they're flying down the road, and we don't see them again. And then we kind of switch scenes to Myrtle's point of view, right? And her husband, Mr. Wilson, he's really sick. He's ill. We don't really know what's wrong with him, but it's kind of a crazy scene.
Yeah.
And he's keeping her up in the attic. She wants to escape. Mm-hmm. He knows she's cheating on him. And he's made it his point that they're going to leave and go out west and get away from everything. So he's kind of kidnapping her. He's holding her hostage in a way. And she escapes. And he kind of tussles with her. And she runs out into the road and she sees a car.
Yeah.
Speeding down. She tries to flag it down. The car hits her, kills her, tears her up so bad it cracks her skull, I think.
Yeah, I think.
And it rips her breasts in half. It's pretty.
The book is very graphic with
in a way,
the description.
And it's kind of obvious that this car is being driven by Jay Gatsby or Daisy.
It is his car.
It's his car.
Yeah.
We figure out later some more details about it, but
yeah.
So she's killed. Myrtle's killed.
It's speculated that she was killed on impact.
Yeah.
But we never get a definitive answer.
But yeah, she's pretty dead, though.
She is pretty dead, yeah.
Tom Buchanan comes upon the scene and doesn't think of anything of it.
Yeah.
And he gets us, let's go see what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And he's kind of excited about it. And then he sees her, and he loses his mind.
Yeah.
And there they almost accuse Tom Buchanan of the one, because he says, I know who did it. I know what car it was. You know what I mean? They almost accuse him of doing it. But he doesn't really tell anybody whose it is, but I guess he's going to exact his revenge his way. Yeah. He knows it's Jay's car. He tells this to the police, what kind of car it was. And he speculates with Mr. Wilson, Myrtle's husband, about who it is. Mm-hmm. And we see Mr. Wilson through the night, and he's losing his mind over this. Right? So we kind of cut away from him, and he's being watched. And then he disappears. He runs off. We don't see him again. So we go back to that evening. Nick goes, Tom Buchanan and Jordan Baker, to Tom and Daisy's house. And by this time, Daisy's there, right? And she seems kind of off. Mm-hmm. And he tells them good night. And as he's leaving, he goes and sees Jay Gatsby hiding in the bushes, kind of stalking the house to see if Tom's going to
physically abuse her.
Yeah, and if Daisy's going to give it up, that she...
Yeah, they come up with a code that she would, Daisy would flash her lights in her room on and off.
Yeah.
If she was being harmed. And it says that Gatsby stayed until like 4 a.m. waiting to see before she finally came out to the window and like waved at her.
Yeah. What's really interesting is while they're here, we realize that Jay wasn't the one driving the car.
Yeah.
He let Daisy drive it. So Daisy was the one that killed her husband's mistress.
Yeah, which is kind of...
And didn't even know it.
Yeah, this is kind of dumb because Daisy remarks about how bad of a driver she is earlier in the story. Yeah. And she says it's not a big deal because all the other drivers should be good. And if the other good drivers do the job, then they can just like go around her, which is a very interesting theory, and I don't think it's very applicable, especially today.
Why'd she stop? And she says, "Well, we knew she was dead, so just kept on going." And was it really their fault though? No, she ran right on the road, right in front of them.
Yeah, see, so like legally,
if they just stopped, they probably wouldn't have been in any trouble. It would have been a horrific accident.
Yeah,
but when they got in trouble,
it was hit and run.
Yeah. And they fled, and then that's where the crime comes in. So Jay hides the car.
Yeah.
And they're laying low, and they're planning on leaving. Him and Daisy are planning on going out west. And they're running away together. And the next day, he's waiting on her phone call, right? Mm-hmm. She says she'll call him the next day, tell him what time for him to pick her up. And he instructs the servant to bring the phone out by the pool. And the servant wants to drain the pool that day, right? Summer's over. And which is we start off this book in late spring when everything's hustle and bustle and energetic. And now we see the
season calms.
The summer's over.
Yeah.
Fall's here. The leaves are dying. The parties have stopped. Jay's in a different place. He doesn't want the parties anymore. After he has Daisy now, what's the point for the parties anymore?
Yeah.
They're done. So Jay decides, he knows he's leaving pretty soon. He decides where he's going to have a day by the pool. So he's sitting by the pool and thinking about Daisy and expecting a phone call from her. And he sees, and it's all of a sudden in the book too. And that's when he looks over and he sees the figure walking towards him, and then he's dead. Mr. Wilson.
Yeah.
Myrtle's wife. It's the whole story is kind of everybody's having affairs with each other. Myrtle's husband, Mr. Wilson, it has been told it's Jay Gatsby, and he flips out and he goes to this crazy, insane, not really crime spree, but he's acting crazy, and he gets a revolver and he shoots Jay Gatsby dead in his own pool, and then he shoots himself. So it's a murder suicide.
Yeah, and what's kind of ironic about this is Jay remarks all summer how he hadn't gotten a chance to get in his pool yet. Mm-hmm. And almost every single time that him and Nick hang out, like he says, like, I haven't got a chance to get in my pool or whatever. And
saying Jay Gatsby, it's almost like me and Ethan's friendship here. Jay Gatsby is always having some kind of plan. He wants to do something. And Nick's always like, No. So see, Jay Gatsby's a big planner, and he always wants to hang out or do something interesting.
Yeah.
And Nick's always saying, "No, sorry," because it's like 4 a.m. Jay said, "Hey, let's go swimming." Nick said, "No." No, he didn't want to do that. So he hasn't swum in the pool all summer.
Yeah, and then the first time he gets in the pool, he dies.
He gets shot. Yeah, and we skipped a bunch of stuff in the book. Like, Jay Gatsby has his friend, like Mr. Wolfstein, and it's pretty well known Jay Gatsby's involved in this illegal bond schemes. That's how he's making a lot of this money.
Alcohol too.
And Jay Gatsby isn't even his real name.
Yeah.
It's
Jimmy Gatz, I think.
Yeah.
Wait, James Gatz?
It's James Gatz. Yeah. And he changed his name, and then he was really poor before the war, and he got involved with this rich fisherman that taught him how to live his life. And a bunch of backstory we skipped over, but you just have to read it for yourself, too. It's a really hard book to really talk about.
James Gatz.
Yeah. James Gatz.
And what's interesting is that Gatsby spelled Gatsby, and Gatz was spelled Gatz.
Yeah. So,
different.
Kind of the same name, but variation of it.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird, and you can kind of see some symbolism of this. He kept part of himself, and part of himself he changed.
Mm-hmm.
Right? He kept the part that he was with Daisy, and he changed a lot too, because he had to. So yeah, he's dead, and Nick's the only person that cares about him.
Yeah.
Daisy doesn't even bother to come around.
Yeah.
So all the people that Jay Gatsby was, obsessed with,
don't even care.
Don't give him the time of day.
They don't even go to his funeral.
No, the people that came to his parties, his associates, that Mr. Wolfstein said he was busy.
Mm-hmm.
All those people that he was so crazy about impressing, in the end, didn't show up. It was Nick and Jay's dad and Jay Gatsby's dad, who supported Jay Gatsby. He wasn't a bad father. Jay just left.
Yeah. And that upset him.
It really upset his dad. Yeah. And his dad was amazed by the life he created.
Yeah, and he pulls out these kind of task lists that Mr. Gatsby had created. Like study this between these times and do this between these times, save $3 every week and stop smoking, stuff like this. Like basically self-improvement. And his dad talks about how amazed he was.
Impressed he was by that.
Yeah, how amazed he was by his son's desire to improve himself.
Yeah. And he always kept a picture of Jay's house in his wallet because he was
proud of him for
he was proud of his son.
And he said his son bought him a house too.
Yeah. So they had so Jay took care of his father almost in a sense. They were definitely not really connected to each other. And that's kind of sad because you see, Jay's dad was he just wanted
to love his son.
Yeah.
And he was absolutely destroyed when he heard that Jay had died, because he said he had so much potential and he could have did such great things, and that didn't get to happen.
And so they had the funeral, and everybody shows up, and that's really pretty much it.
Yeah, and Nick's calling people trying
to get people to come.
Yeah, and one that really stuck out to me is that Tom. He called Tom, and Tom kind of really spit in Nick's face, and kind of said that he was happy that Gatsby had died.
Yeah.
And that he deserved it, or he had it coming.
Yeah, and it's so complicated, and it's bad, but you can look at, there's so many angles you can look at in this story, right? From different characters' points of views. Are these people really wrong in the way they're feeling?
Yeah, and to be fair, a lot of them don't really know all the details like Nick does. Nick's kind of unique in the story because he kind of hears it all, because everyone kind of confides in him in a way.
Yeah. So.
And I guess this goes back to the beginning of the book, because he listened more than he spoke, right?
Yeah.
And
everybody else does not.
Yeah. And that gave him the opportunity or the chance to
pick up on things,
figure everything out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the book, when I read it a few months ago, I really enjoyed it. I really did. Yeah. It put me in a weird mood, kind of in a way. You see, things are so great, right?
The Great Gatsby.
Yeah, and then It's not.
Yeah.
And it talks about Nick. He's moving away. He can't stand to be in New York. He's like, it's the most unhappiest place on earth now that Jay's dead. And the night before Nick leaves for good, and Daisy and Tom have already moved way out west. Mm-hmm. Nick's going back to Cleveland. And the night before he leaves, he goes to Jay's house. And at this point, it's been overran. Yeah. People have stolen stuff. They've ransacked it. And it's just, all the magic is gone. Yeah. And the story is kind of like, you see, can we relive the past almost? Do you think we can?
No, I don't think so. It already happened. You can't redo it.
But why can't you go after what you want?
Well, you can. You can go after what you wanted before, but you can't relive what has already happened.
That's where I think that really what Jay went wrong. He could have had what he wanted before.
Yeah, he just wanted everything.
He wanted it to be exactly the same.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be.
He could have had that person, but he had to realize that people had grown during that time.
Yeah.
So he could have had what he wanted. He could have had the past, but he couldn't have had the past the way he wanted it to.
He wanted to go back in time and change the past.
He wanted to be married in her old house. Because that was the plan. They were going to get married in her old house. Mm-hmm. So almost to the T. Jay was a dreamer, and he had the plans all built up in his head. And he wanted to do the things he always wanted to do. And he couldn't realize that he had to give a little bit. Yeah. And I think that was his downfall. It really was. Yeah. And you see great things die in the story, and that's really interesting too.
Yeah. And I think this book kind of reminded me about how fragile life is.
Yeah.
Because just within the last few pages, 2 people die instantly. Hit by a car, shot, and there's not really much you could have done to prevent either. I mean, I guess you could. Don't look both ways before you cross the road, and don't sunbathe on your pool. But
don't hit and run. That type of stuff. I mean, that's your generic.
Yeah.
Don't do it lesson from the book, but people can learn a lot from this book. Yeah. Love, obsession, how it can be very
dangerous, really.
Yeah.
Destructive towards relationships too. Just because you love someone doesn't mean that.
You've heard the saying, "Love's the most dangerous thing on earth."
Yeah. Just because you love someone doesn't mean you should necessarily listen to that love. Because Jay loved Daisy, and then he was obsessed with Daisy, and then
it was love, but love's different than obsession.
But I'm saying
it turned unhealthy.
Yeah, love can turn into obsession, I think.
Yeah. It was definitely off. But yeah, I mean, you can learn a lot about that in this story. Very interesting. My name is Jeffrey Watson.
And I'm Ethan Edwards.
And this is the Ridge Podcast.
You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pandora, iHeartRadio, YouTube, Instagram, and as well as your favorite podcasting app. Our email is theridgepodcast@gmail.com, and our website is theridgepodcast.com.
If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you.